Hey guys, Greg Collins here with Linemount.com, and today we're at the Linemount offices and we're talking about the 1958 field trials that had a big influence on the design and history of the AR-15 rifle, and in particular how it relates to retro AR parts. Anyway, we have an example here of a retro style AR-15, at least the upper receiver and the buttstock. You'll have to excuse the later model lower. The AR-15 retro parts era can be divided into three important milestones. The first being the forming of the Armalite Company in 1954. The second being the 1958 Infantry Board Field Trials. And the third being the 1963 Department of Defense contract. So, how did the AR-15 end up in the 1958 Infantry Board Field Trials? And how did it influence the design of retro AR-15s? So let's find out. Let me give you some backstory behind how the AR-15 caught the attention of the U.S. military. So the late 1950s was not a good time to try and introduce a new rifle to the U.S. military because in 1957, the Army and Navy adopted the M14 as a replacement for the M1 Garand. The Air Force didn't adopt the M14. The M1 Garand was the workhorse basic infantry rifle for the U.S. through World War II and Korea. So how did the AR-15 even make it into consideration? It wasn't like Armalite was the only company in the U.S. innovating new firearms. It's a huge country with a deep heritage of firearms manufacturing and innovation that goes back centuries. Companies and individual inventors in the U.S. were and still are continuously innovating around firearms. So what gave the AR-15 a crucial advantage over the other designs? And it was this. The head of Fairchild Engine and Airplane Corporation, which was the parent company of Armalite, was Richard Boutelle. Richard Boutelle was good buddies with Curtis LeMay, who was Chief of Staff of the Air Force, and a huge personality with a massive clout in the Air Force at the time. So Boutelle and LeMay would hang out. They went on a big safari hunting trip to Africa. They were pals. Now, as an interesting side note, in the show notes, I'll include a link to an article from a magazine, from Life magazine from 1957, that details the safari, which included Boutelle and Curtis LeMay, where they were using a helicopter to fly around, and they were enthusiastically publicizing activities that would never be allowed today. It's kind of an interesting historical artifact of that era. Anyway, it was this relationship between Boutelle and Curtis LeMay that was the foot in the door for the AR-15, because it was the Air Force under Curtis LeMay that took an interest in and was the driving force behind introducing the AR-15 to the Air Force, which in turn would allow it to shortly thereafter become the standard platform for all of the U.S. Armed Forces. Now, back to the 1958 Infantry Board Field Trials. What was the Infantry Board? It was a group of 30 or 40 soldiers at Fort Benning in Georgia whose role within the Army was roughly to lay out broad requirements and priorities for what weapons should be evaluated. The board was actually an assigned unit for members of the Army, so their tenure on the board was only like 3 years or so. Anyway, other departments of the Army, other departments of the Army's vast organization were in charge of more technical evaluations and other aspects of new weapons. But anyway, at this time in 1957, the Infantry Board said they weren't happy with the Army's decision to move forward with the M14, and so they asked for potential alternatives. Keep in mind, there was tremendous amount of institutional inertia within the Army behind the M14. The Infantry Board was thus in direct bureaucratic conflict with the Army's Ordnance Department, which had just selected the M14 as the next Army service rifle in 1957. Now, since World War II and into the 1950s, more advanced techniques for scientifically evaluating various dimensions of ground combat were coming into fashion in the areas of rifle fire in combat and also ballistics as well as other areas. So, in fact, during the Korean War, which was 1950 to 1953, a bunch of analysts actually went to Korea to evaluate how exactly rifles were being used in combat. What they found among other things, was that most rifle shots were taken at targets that were less than 300 yards away. Most of the time, they weren't actually seeing targets when they were shooting. They only aimed about 15% of their shots. And the philosophy of the infantrymen on the ground was to just lay down fire in the general direction of the enemy. So then, the Infantry Board points to these new studies and said, hey, the M14 is not as well suited for combat as combat is actually fought. So let's take a look at some other more innovative alternatives. Now, in 1957, the Infantry Board then brings in Eugene Stoner, the main design engineer behind the AR-15, out to Fort Benning for discussions about new possible rifle designs. So at this point in 1957, you have two totally different pockets within the vast Defense Department who were open to the AR-15. On the one hand, you have this small organization of forward-thinking individuals on the Infantry Board who don't have a whole lot of organizational influence within the infantry branch of the Army, and they're looking at looking for a new rifle. Well, simultaneously, you had Curtis LeMay, who is a hugely influential individual at the top of the Air Force. Now, these interests of these two very different parties would converge on the AR-15, and then within just a few short years lead to full-on adoption of the AR platform across the entire U.S. military. So the Infantry Board's next step was to evaluate new rifles, and this led to the 1958 Infantry Board Field Trials. So the field trials turned out to be just a pivotal event in the evolution of U.S. military small arms. The trial evaluated an early version of the AR-15 against the just adopted service rifle, the M14, and also a few emerging competitors. The result of these field trials was a change to the design and some of the parts of the AR-15, and it also removed and added what we sort of colloquially refer to as some retro parts. Now, the 1958 infantry trials took place in March of 1958, and the board assessed rifles on a few different dimensions. And the first was accuracy, so from 25 to 500 yards, in both semi-auto and full auto. Also, recoil, weight, reliability, ergonomics. And they also did field tests to see how easy it was to clean and take apart, etc. During the trials, it became clear that the AR-15 was superior to the M14 in a number of important ways. The soldiers testing the AR-15 really liked it compared to the M14. The AR-15 had only about a third of the number of malfunctions that the M14 was experiencing. Now, this may come as a surprise for those who know some of the later history of the M16, but that's what these field trials showed, and we have to take them at their word. So the AR-15 was flatter shooting, and this made it easier to hit targets at longer ranges because you don't have to compensate for elevation to the same degree that you do for the M14. The AR-15 was lighter at 6.5 pounds. The M14 is over 9 pounds. And this meant the AR-15 was easier to carry, and lower weight of the ammunition meant soldiers could carry twice as many rounds. It's also easier to control during full auto fire, the AR-15 is. Now, the AR-15 is not exactly that great for accurate full auto, but it is when compared to the M14, which is just totally uncontrollable during automatic fire. Now, a lot of things happened to the AR-15 as a result of the 1958 field trials, both in terms of raising its profile and prospects as a potential new standard rifle within the U.S. military, and with regard to mechanical improvements to the design. Because the results of the field trials were so favorable for the AR-15 relative to the M14, it started to change the Army's direction in favor of the AR-15. The trials were really a launch pad for the AR-15 design. Also, the data received from the 1958 field trials meant the AR-15 could continue forward for other tests, for other branches, including the Air Force. Had the 1958 field trials gone poorly for the AR-15, or if it had only done about as good as the M14, it might have been the end of the road for the AR-15 platform. So, also, from a mechanical perspective, the Armalite engineers learned a lot about what was working and wasn't working with the AR-15. It was after these field trials that a number of important changes to the design and to what we refer to as retro parts, some of them changed quite a bit. The most important mechanical change after the field trials is that the charging handle moved from inside the carry handle to the back of the carry handle, where we all are familiar with it today. The problem with having the charging handle inside the carry handle was that it's very hard to operate it with heavy gloves. And that's a problem in winter conditions. Also, the charging handle, when it's located here, tended to get hot during heavy firing. The other changes they made, some of the more significant ones, were that they replaced the sort of cone-style handguard with the two-piece style that we're familiar with today, this sort of retro style. There's actually an earlier version that was a cone. Anyway, the 1958 field trials had a big impact on the AR-15, both from a mechanical perspective and from the perspective of its potential to become the main service rifle in the U.S. military. Anyway, if you liked the video, please like and subscribe and leave a comment. Thank you for watching.